Our latest UK poverty report shows that there are 14.3 million people in the UK who are living in poverty, and of those people, 4.3 million are children. At the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we are calling on the government to step up and take bold action as part of their child poverty strategy.
Child poverty in the UK is unacceptably high. Can you paint a picture of what that's like at the minute?
We've just completed our latest UK poverty analysis, and what that tells us is that there are 4.3 million children in the UK growing up in poverty. That's in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And what that means for those kids is that they will be growing up in households where their parents may be skipping meals to ensure that the kids can eat properly. They might be growing up in damp, cold, overcrowded housing, and certainly growing up in quite a high stress environment, because when you are struggling to make ends meet week to week, month to month, that is extremely stressful and puts pressure on people's mental health. And that has an impact on children's well-being in the here and now, but it also has an impact on their prospects in the future. And as part of the analysis, we also look ahead to the end of this Parliament, so to 2029, to ask what might happen in that time period based on what we know now. And what we see is that by 2029 in England, almost 1 in 3 children will still be in poverty. That's virtually unchanged from now. Whereas in Scotland, we see a slightly different picture where it's closer to 1 in 5. So a much lower rate of poverty in Scotland. And what that tells us is that this is a situation that can change, and the policy choices that are made are really important for that.
Why is there such a stark difference between England and Scotland looking ahead?
Well, we should be clear that there is already a difference in rates of child poverty for England and Scotland. So Scotland already has a slightly lower rate of child poverty. Sort of in recent years, that's been the case largely because Scotland has slightly lower housing costs, so that's less of a burden on families. But actually, when we look ahead, what we see is some of the choices that have been made in Scotland, particularly the support that is being given to families with children, that is making the difference. So in Scotland, they have created something called the Scottish Child Payment. That's about £27 per week per child to families in receipt of universal credit. And from 2026, the Scottish Government has also said that it is going to do away with the 2-child limit in the benefit system. Now, that is something that currently exists across the whole of the UK, whereby you don't get additional support for a 3rd or subsequent child. We wouldn't turn away a sick child from hospital, we wouldn't prevent them from going to school, yet in our social security system, if you have a 3rd child, you do not get the additional support that you would get for a 1st or 2nd child. Now that drives up poverty. And those policy choices show that this future that is in our projections does not have to be the case. It is very much about the change that we need to see, the policy choices that can be made to make a difference to children's lives.
You've talked a lot about the policy choices that the government can make. What about economic growth? Will that make a difference to child poverty in countries across the UK?
A strong economy is certainly important here, and good jobs. Those 2 things are important for poverty. But actually, what we see is when we model, as part of our projections, a strongly growing economy that's creating lots of jobs, we still see very little difference to the child poverty rate in England. And actually what we see in Scotland is it's some of those changes that have been made to social security and to the support that is given to some of the worst off families that make that difference. And actually, when you look back to the past, we saw big changes, big falls in child poverty across the UK in the late 90s and early 2000s. What worked then was a combination of a growing economy, rising employment, but crucially, really ambitious changes to social security. And it's those 3 things together that really made the difference. And so what we are seeing in Scotland is that focus on supporting families receiving universal credit and social security. That is the level of ambition and the investment that we also need to see in other parts of the UK as well. It's important to say that Scotland's not getting everything right here. They have ambitious child poverty targets that they are currently not on course to meet. They still need to go further, but the difference in the direction of travel, falling rates in Scotland, stuck very high rates in England, that is something that needs to change.
So what is at stake, Katie? What happens if we don't act now?
Well, what we will see if we don't make those choices is levels of child poverty remaining around almost 1 in 3 in England, whilst in Scotland, by the end of the Parliament, they will be much closer to 1 in 5. That is a big difference. That is a difference that has an impact on children's lives and on their prospects. And what it really shows us is the need to fix our social security system. Universal credit is there to support people when they fall on hard times, but at the moment it is failing to protect people from hardship. But the basic rate of social security for an adult is £91 per week. That is to cover food, heating, basic household bills, being able to get around. I mean, that is simply not enough to cover life's essentials.
It's clear that such high rates of child poverty aren't inevitable. What steps can we take to bring those levels down?
Well, a couple of things that we would really like to see is targeted support to some of those families that have the highest risk of child poverty. So, for example, large families, if we were to get rid of the 2-child limit, that would make a massive difference for those families. We also need to rebuild our social security system of universal credit so that it does genuinely provide protection to people when they fall on hard times, and at the very least they are able to afford life's essentials. Now, the government has a really important opportunity ahead of it. In its manifesto, it committed to creating an ambitious child poverty strategy. We're expecting that to be published later on in 2025. We need to see that strategy really begin the job of rebuilding and investing in our social security system so that it is reducing poverty for families with children, and it is the protection that families need when they fall on hard times.
And what would you say to those policymakers who are currently working on the government's child poverty strategy?
I would say they need to be ambitious. I would also say that they need to believe that they can make a difference here. The choices that are made as part of this child poverty strategy, that decision to invest in our social security system so it does provide support to families with children, those are the things that can make this a country where every child gets the best start in life. And that is something that we would all agree needs to happen.